The silence over Kandahar province was broken only by the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades cutting through the thin mountain air. Major Victoria, Trust Fund. Blackwood adjusted her grip on the cyclic stick of her Ah-64 Apache, watching the thermal display paint ghostly figures moving through the valley below. Her weapon systems officer, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rivera, shifted uncomfortably in the gunner's seat ahead of her. Viper 17, this is Overwatch, the radio crackled. We have eyes on your target area. Multiple heat signatures, approximately 15 tangos, entrenched in the compound walls. Victoria's jaw tightened. 3 months into her deployment, and the whispers still followed her into every briefing room, every chow hall, every pre-flight inspection. The oil heiress who bought her wings. The senator's daughter playing soldier. The liability with a trust fund larger than most military budgets. Roger, Overwatch, she responded, her voice steady despite the familiar knot in her stomach. Viper 17 maintaining Overwatch position. But tonight felt different. Tonight, 16 Navy SEALs were pinned down in that compound, their extraction helicopter smoking wreckage in the courtyard. Tonight, the jokes about her father's petroleum empire and her mother's political connections seemed as distant as the stars above the Hindu Kush. Trust Fund, Rivera's voice came through the intercom, using the call sign that had followed her from flight school. Ground team's been dark for 12 minutes. Last transmission indicated heavy contact, multiple casualties. Victoria's eyes swept across the instrument panel, each green glow a familiar friend in the darkness. The Apache hung in the air like a mechanical predator, its 30 chain gun and Hellfire missiles waiting for her command. Below, the compound where SEAL Team 6 had been conducting a high-value target raid had become their tomb. Viper 17, be advised, came another voice from the Tactical Operations Center. Colonel James Harrison, the man who'd made it clear he'd never asked for a billionaire's daughter in his command. Rules of engagement remain weapons tight. We need positive ID on all targets before engagement. The thermal imaging showed movement in the compound's outer buildings. Muzzle flashes sparked like deadly fireflies against her night vision. Somewhere in that maze of mud walls and narrow alleys, America's most elite warriors were fighting for their lives. Victoria had trained for this moment at Fort Rucker, had dreamed of it during countless simulator hours, had prepared for it through every dismissive comment and skeptical glance. But nothing had prepared her for the weight of real lives hanging in the balance, or the crushing pressure of proving herself worthy of the wings she wore. The radio fell silent, leaving only the Apache's engine noise and her own steady breathing. In the distance, tracer rounds painted red streaks across the darkness. Overwatch, Viper 17, Victoria transmitted, her voice cutting through the static. Request immediate clearance to engage. I have visual on hostile positions. Negative, Viper 17. Maintain holding pattern. Fast movers inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Rivera turned in his seat, his helmet silhouette visible in her peripheral vision. 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours for the men trapped below. Through her targeting system, she could see the thermal signatures clustering around what appeared to be the compound's main building, the SEAL's last known position. "Ma'am," Rivera's voice was tight with controlled urgency, "I'm seeing movement on the rooftops. Looks like they're setting up for a final push." Victoria's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, cycling through different sensor modes. The forward-looking infrared painted the scene in stark white-hot signatures against cool black backgrounds. Armed figures moved with tactical discipline between buildings, their weapons clearly visible as they maneuvered for better firing positions. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from a conversation 3 years ago. "Victoria, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Come work for the company. Leave the military heroics to people who actually need the job." The words had stung then, and they burned now with the heat of unspoken challenges. Viper 17, this is Groundhog 6, A new voice broke through the radio chatter, weak, strained, barely audible over the background noise. "We are heavily engaged, multiple KIA, running low on ammunition." Victoria's breath caught. That was Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, SEAL Team 6's officer in charge. She'd met him briefly during the mission briefing, had seen the skeptical look in his eyes when she'd introduced herself as their air support. "Groundhog 6, Viper 17, she responded immediately. "I have you on thermal. Can you mark your position?" Static filled the channel for long seconds before Morrison's voice returned, weaker now. "Negative on marking device. We're in the northeast corner of the compound, two-story building, white walls. Hostiles have us surrounded on 3 sides." Rivera was already adjusting the targeting pod, zooming in on the building Morrison had described. Through the thermal display, Victoria could see the heat signatures of the SEALs, distinct from their enemies by their different equipment signatures and tactical positions. "Colonel Harrison, this is Viper 17, Victoria transmitted on the command frequency. "Ground team is in immediate danger. Request permission to engage." "Trust fund," Harrison's voice carried its usual edge of irritation. "You will maintain position until the F-16s arrive. That's an order." The night sky stretched endlessly above them, stars cold and distant, indifferent to the life-and-death drama playing out below. The Apache shuddered slightly as Victoria adjusted their position, maintaining the delicate hover that kept them invisible against the star-filled sky. Through her night vision goggles, the landscape below looked like an alien world painted in shades of green and black. The compound sprawled across perhaps 2 acres, its high walls casting geometric shadows in the pale moonlight. "Movement on the south wall," Rivera reported, his voice professional despite the tension crackling through the intercom. "Count 4. Make that 6 hostiles with RPGs." Victoria's blood ran cold. Rocket-propelled grenades would turn the SEAL's defensive position into a killing ground in seconds. Her thumb hovered over the weapon's release button, muscle memory from hundreds of training flights screaming at her to engage. "Overwatch, Viper 17. I have hostile forces positioning RPGs for assault on friendly positions. Request immediate clearance to engage." "Negative, Viper 17. Maintain current position. Fast movers are 8 minutes out." 8 minutes. Victoria closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the weight of 16 lives pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. When she'd been 8 years old, sitting in the back seat of her father's Gulfstream, she'd watched military jets practicing formation flights and dreamed of being up there with them. Not because of the thrill or the prestige, but because of the certainty in their movements, the purposefulness of their mission. "Trust fund," Rivera's voice cut through her memories. "We've got incoming transmission from the ground team." Morrison's voice filled their headsets, barely a whisper now. "Viper 17. We have 2 urgent surgical, bleeding out fast. If you can see those RPG positions, we need help now." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. 2 urgent surgical meant 2 men dying, their lives measured in heartbeats and blood loss. Her weapon systems painted target boxes around each hostile position with mathematical precision. Range, 1,847 meters. Wind, negligible. Probability of hit, 97%. "Colonel Harrison," Victoria transmitted, switching to the command frequency. "Ground team has 2 urgent surgical casualties. They will not survive 8 minutes." Harrison's response came back clipped and final. "Major Blackwood, you will follow orders. Air support is not authorized to engage without positive identification protocols." Victoria stared at the thermal display, watching as the RPG teams shifted into final attack positions. In her peripheral vision, she caught Rivera's helmet turning toward her, waiting for her decision. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady rhythm of rotor blades and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire. The sky above them remained unchanged, eternal and indifferent, while below, time ran out like sand through an hourglass. Viper 17, this is Groundhog 6. Morrison's voice came through the radio, weaker now, punctuated by the sharp crack of gunfire. They're moving in for final assault. We're down to last magazine per man. Victoria's hands were steady on the controls, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Through the Apache sensors, she watched the thermal signatures of hostile forces converging on the SEAL's position like wolves closing in on wounded prey. The RPG teams had reached their firing positions, the distinctive signatures of their weapons clearly visible against the cool night air. Rivera's voice was tight with controlled desperation. "Ma'am, they're lining up for the kill shot. Those SEALs won't survive the next 60 seconds." The moment crystallized around Victoria like ice forming on a winter lake. 3 years of flight training, 2 years of combat preparation, and a lifetime of proving herself worthy of the uniform she wore, all of it had led to this single decision. Her father's money couldn't help her here. Her mother's political connections were useless in the thin air above Kandahar province. There was only her, the Apache, and the choice between following orders and saving lives. "Colonel Harrison," she transmitted one final time, "I'm declaring this a troops-in-contact emergency, engaging hostile forces to prevent imminent friendly casualties." "Major Blackwood, you are expressly ordered to." Victoria switched off the command frequency. "Rivera, you with me on this?" Her weapons systems officer didn't hesitate. "All the way, ma'am, light them up." Victoria's thumb pressed the weapon's release button. The Apache's 30 chain gun came alive with a sound like the world's deadliest sewing machine, its depleted uranium rounds seeking out the RPG teams with surgical precision. Through her targeting display, she watched as the first hostile position erupted in a brief flare of white-hot destruction. "Target destroyed," Rivera called out, already shifting to the next threat, moving to secondary positions. The remaining hostile forces scattered like startled insects, but Victoria's training took over completely now. The Apache moved through the sky with deadly grace, its sensors tracking each moving target with mechanical inevitability. Her second burst caught a group of fighters trying to retreat across the compound's central courtyard, the chain guns rounds stitching a line of devastation across their position. "This is Groundhog 6, Morrison's voice came through with renewed strength. "Jesus Christ, Viper 17, beautiful shooting. Hostile pressure has dropped significantly." But Victoria wasn't done. Through her thermal imaging, she could see additional fighters moving through the compound's outer buildings, trying to flank the SEAL's position. Her Hellfire missiles waited in their pods like caged lightning, each one capable of turning a building into rubble. The night sky bore silent witness as the Apache continued its deadly work. The Hellfire missile streaked through the darkness like a falling star, its trail invisible to the naked eye but blazing white-hot in Victoria's targeting display. The explosion that followed lit up the compound's eastern wall in a brief, violent sunrise, silhouetting the remaining hostile forces against the flames. "Direct hit on the machine gun nest," Rivera reported, his professional calm barely masking his satisfaction, "counting at least 6 enemy KIA." Victoria was already shifting targets, the Apache responding to her touch like an extension of her own body. Years of training had carved these movements into muscle memory, but the weight of real combat was something no simulator could replicate. Each trigger pull meant taking a life. Each missile launch carried the responsibility of split-second life-and-death decisions. "Viper 17, this is Groundhog 6, Morrison's voice carried new energy. "Hostile fire has decreased significantly. We're beginning medical treatment on our wounded." "Roger, Groundhog 6. I'm seeing scattered movement in the compound's western section. Recommend you maintain defensive positions while I clear the remaining threats." Through her sensors, Victoria tracked the last pockets of resistance. The enemy fighters were no longer operating with tactical discipline. They were running, scrambling for cover wherever they could find it. But Victoria had learned in flight school that wounded animals were often the most dangerous, and desperate men with weapons could still kill American soldiers. Her third Hellfire missile eliminated a sniper position in the compound's water tower. The fourth turned a weapons cache into a secondary explosion that shook the Apache even at their altitude. One by one, the thermal signatures on her display went cold and still. "Ma'am," Rivera's voice carried a new tone, something between admiration and concern. "Command frequency is lighting up. Colonel Harrison is not happy." Victoria's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Let him be unhappy. Those SEALs are alive because we broke his precious rules." She switched back to the ground team's frequency. "Groundhog 6, Viper 17. Area appears clear of hostile forces. What's your status on casualties?" Morrison's response came quickly. "Two urgent surgical, both stable for now. We need immediate dust-off for medical evacuation." "Roger that. I'll provide cover until the medical bird arrives." Victoria's eyes swept across the compound one final time, searching for any remaining threats. The fires from her missile strikes cast dancing shadows across the courtyard, where the SEAL's original extraction helicopter lay twisted and smoking. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small human drama that had just played out below. But for Victoria, something fundamental had changed in those few minutes of combat. The whispers about her wealth, the doubts about her competence, the questions about her place in the military, none of that mattered now. 20 minutes later, the medical evacuation helicopter disappeared into the night, carrying the wounded SEALs toward the trauma surgeons at Bagram Air Base. Victoria watched its navigation lights fade into the distance before beginning her own return flight, the Apache's fuel gauges showing just enough reserves to make it home. Rivera had been unusually quiet during the flight back, but as they approached their forward operating base, he finally spoke through the intercom. "Ma'am, what you did back there, that was the right call." Victoria didn't respond immediately, her attention focused on the landing approach. The base sprawled below them like a small city of lights, temporary structures and sandbag barriers creating geometric patterns in the darkness. But her mind kept returning to Morrison's voice over the radio, the weakness that had spoken of men bleeding out in a foreign land, far from home and family. They touched down with barely a bump, the Apache settling onto its landing skids with mechanical precision. As Victoria ran through the post-flight shutdown checklist, she could see vehicles approaching across the flight line. Military police, most likely, along with whatever disciplinary committee Colonel Harrison had assembled to deal with her insubordination. "Major Blackwood," Rivera said as they climbed out of the aircraft, "whatever happens next, you saved 16 lives tonight. Don't let them take that away from you." Victoria pulled off her helmet and looked up at the night sky one more time. The same stars that had watched her disobey direct orders, that had witnessed her first real combat engagement, that had been silent observers to a moment that would define the rest of her military career. "Trust fund," she said quietly, testing the call sign that had followed her since flight school. "Maybe it's time that meant something different." The approaching vehicles stopped 50 meters from the flight line, their headlights creating harsh pools of white light in the darkness. Victoria squared her shoulders and walked toward them, her flight boots crunching on the gravel. Behind her, the Apache's engines ticked and cooled in the night air, the aircraft that had become her partner in saving American lives. Colonel Harrison climbed out of the lead vehicle, his face set in hard lines even in the dim light. Two military police officers flanked him, along with what appeared to be the base's operations officer and intelligence chief. "Major Blackwood," Harrison's voice carried the weight of military justice, "you are under arrest for willful disobedience of direct orders in a combat zone." Victoria stopped in front of him and came to attention. "Yes, sir." "You deliberately ignored explicit commands, and engaged hostile forces without authorization. Yes, sir, I did. Harrison studied her face for a long moment. And do you have anything to say in your defense? Victoria thought of Morrison's voice over the radio, of the thermal signatures she'd watched through her targeting system, of 2 wounded SEALs who were now receiving life-saving medical treatment instead of bleeding out in a compound courtyard. No, sir, no defense necessary. The holding cell at Forward Operating Base Chapman was a concrete box barely large enough for a cot and a metal sink, its single window offering a view of the perimeter fence and the mountains beyond. Victoria had been sitting on the thin mattress for 6 hours, still wearing her flight suit, watching the sun rise over the Hindu Kush through steel mesh. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, accompanied by the jingle of keys. Victoria expected to see the military police sergeant who had brought her morning meal, but instead, Lieutenant Commander Morrison stepped into view, his left arm in a sling and his face bearing fresh bandages. "Major Blackwood," he said as the guard unlocked the cell door, "mind if I sit down?" Victoria gestured to the small metal chair beside the cot. Morrison moved carefully, favoring his injured side, but his eyes were alert and focused. "How are your men?" Victoria asked. "Alive. Both of the urgent surgical cases are stable. Petty Officer Johnson is going to lose some mobility in his left shoulder, and Petty Officer Martinez has a long road ahead with physical therapy, but they'll make full recoveries." Morrison paused, studying Victoria's face. "Thanks to you. I just did my job." Morrison shook his head. "No, ma'am, you did a lot more than that. You risked your career, your freedom, maybe your entire future to save men you'd never met." Through the small window, Victoria could see aircraft moving on the distant flight line. Apache helicopters, their rotor blades folded, waiting for the next mission. She wondered if she would ever fly one again. "The preliminary investigation is already underway," Morrison continued. "Colonel Harrison is pushing for a court-martial on charges of willful disobedience and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." Victoria nodded, having expected as much. Military justice was swift and unforgiving, especially when it came to officers who ignored direct orders from superior commanders. "But there's something else you should know," Morrison said, leaning forward slightly. "My team has submitted formal statements to the investigating officer. Every single one of my men has testified that your actions saved their lives, and that any other course of action would have resulted in multiple American casualties." "That's unexpected." Morrison smiled grimly. "We don't forget people who stick their necks out for us, Major, and we don't let them face the consequences alone." He stood up carefully, wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. "There's going to be a lot of attention on this case. Media attention, political attention, Pentagon attention. Your father's influence, your family's connections, all of that is going to come into play whether you want it to or not." Victoria felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. The trust fund call sign, the whispers about bought commissions and political favoritism, all of it would resurface now with renewed intensity. "But I want you to know something," Morrison continued. "When I write my after-action report, when I testify at your hearing, I'm not going to mention your family or your money or any of that other bullshit. I'm going to talk about an Army pilot who risked everything to save American lives." The Article 32 hearing convened 3 weeks later in a sterile conference room at Bagram Air Base, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the assembled officers who would determine Victoria's fate. Colonel Harrison sat at the prosecution table, his uniform crisp and his expression coldly professional. Across from him, Major Patricia Hernandez, Victoria's appointed defense counsel, shuffled through thick folders of evidence and testimony. Victoria sat straight-backed in her dress blues, her ribbons and wings gleaming under the artificial light. She had refused her father's offer to hire civilian counsel, just as she had refused her mother's suggestion to leverage political connections in Washington. This was her fight, and she would face it on her own terms. "This hearing will come to order," announced Colonel Rebecca Walsh, the investigating officer. "We are here to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to warrant general court-martial proceedings against Major Victoria Blackwood, United States Army, on charges of willful disobedience of lawful orders and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." Harrison stood and began his opening statement, his voice carrying the weight of military tradition and the absolute necessity of following orders in combat. He painted Victoria as a reckless officer who had endangered military operations by ignoring explicit commands from her superior officer. "The defendant's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, represent a fundamental breakdown of military discipline," Harrison declared. "If officers in combat zones are permitted to ignore lawful orders based on their own personal judgment, the entire command structure becomes meaningless." When Harrison finished, Major Hernandez rose for the defense opening. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, a former JAG officer with 20 years of experience in military law. "Colonel Walsh, the defense does not dispute that Major Blackwood disobeyed a direct order. However, we contend that her actions were not only justified but necessary to prevent the imminent death of American servicemen. Military law recognizes the principle of necessity, and we will demonstrate that Major Blackwood's actions saved 16 lives that would otherwise have been lost." The first witness was Lieutenant Commander Morrison, still moving carefully due to his injuries, but speaking with clear, unwavering conviction. "Major Blackwood's intervention was the difference between life and death for my team," he testified. "We had multiple casualties, were low on ammunition, and were facing imminent assault by superior forces. Without her air support, none of us would have survived." Harrison's cross-examination was sharp but ineffective. Morrison's testimony remained consistent. Victoria's actions had saved American lives when following orders would have resulted in American deaths. One by one, the surviving members of SEAL Team 6 took the witness stand, each telling the same story from slightly different perspectives. The weight of their testimony began to fill the room like flood water, impossible to ignore or dismiss. The hearing stretched into its second day, then its third, as technical experts analyzed radio communications and tactical specialists debated rules of engagement protocols. On the fourth day of the hearing, Colonel Walsh called for a brief recess before hearing closing arguments. Victoria stepped outside the conference building, needing fresh air and a moment to process the testimony she had heard. The Afghan sun was already climbing toward its midday intensity, but the morning air still carried the coolness of the mountain heights. She found herself thinking about the night that had started it all, about the decision she had made in the darkness above Kandahar province. At the time, it had seemed simple. American soldiers were dying, and she had the power to save them. The consequences, court-martial, potential imprisonment, the end of her military career, had all seemed secondary to the immediate need to preserve American lives. "Major Blackwood." Victoria turned to find General Patricia Morrison approaching, her 3 stars catching the morning sunlight. Victoria snapped to attention, but the general waved her to a more relaxed posture. "I wanted to speak with you before the hearing concludes," General Morrison said. "I've been following this case with considerable interest." "Yes, ma'am. I've read all the testimony, reviewed the tactical analysis, and spoken with several of the personnel involved. I've also had extensive conversations with Pentagon leadership about the broader implications of your case." Victoria waited, unsure whether this conversation would help or hurt her position. "The fact is, Major, you were faced with an impossible choice. Follow orders and watch American soldiers die, or disobey orders and save American lives. It's the kind of decision that defines military careers and shapes military history. General Morrison paused, studying Victoria's face intently. Your actions that night demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical judgment and moral courage we need in our combat leaders. Yes, you disobeyed a direct order, but you did so to preserve American lives when following that order would have resulted in American deaths. Thank you, ma'am, but I understood the risks when I made my decision. I'm sure you did, and that makes what you did even more remarkable. General Morrison smiled slightly. The Pentagon has been watching this case very closely, Major. We've been watching you very closely. Your flying skills, your tactical judgment, your leadership under pressure, all of it has been noted at the highest levels. Victoria felt a flutter of hope, but tried not to let it show on her face. Regardless of how this hearing concludes, I want you to know that your actions that night have not gone unnoticed or unappreciated. The Army needs officers willing to take calculated risks to save American lives. With that, General Morrison turned and walked back toward the conference building, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts and the endless Afghan sky stretching overhead. Major Hernandez delivered her closing argument with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a true believer. She walked the investigating officer through each element of Victoria's decision-making process, from the initial intelligence reports to the final missile strikes that had eliminated the hostile forces. Colonel Walsh, the evidence is clear and unambiguous. Major Blackwood was faced with an immediate choice: follow orders and watch 16 American servicemen die, or take action to save their lives. She chose to save American lives, and every single one of those men is alive today because of her courage and skill. Hernandez paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Military law recognizes the principle of necessity, that illegal acts may be justified when committed to prevent greater harm. Major Blackwood's actions were not those of a reckless officer ignoring authority, but those of a combat leader making split-second decisions under extreme pressure to preserve American lives. Harrison's closing argument focused on the absolute necessity of military discipline and the dangerous precedent that would be set by excusing disobedience, regardless of the outcome. If we allow officers to ignore lawful orders whenever they disagree with their superior's judgment, we undermine the entire foundation of military command structure, he argued. Major Blackwood's actions, while producing a favorable outcome, represent a fundamental breach of military discipline that cannot be overlooked or excused. Colonel Walsh retired to consider her recommendation, leaving Victoria to wait in the hallway outside the conference room with Major Hernandez and a growing crowd of observers who had learned about the hearing through military networks and media coverage. Lieutenant Commander Morrison sat in a nearby chair, still wearing his dress blues despite his medical leave status. Several members of his SEAL team had also remained for the conclusion of the hearing, their presence a silent testament to their support for the pilot who had saved their lives. "Whatever happens," Morrison said quietly, "you did the right thing that night. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Victoria nodded, but her thoughts were focused on the future. If she was found guilty and court-martialed, her military career would be over. She would return to civilian life carrying the weight of a conviction for disobedience. Her dreams of serving her country ended by a single decision made in the darkness above Afghanistan. An hour later, Colonel Walsh returned to the conference room and called the hearing back to order. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented," she began, her voice carrying the weight of military justice, "I find that while Major Blackwood did technically violate Article 92 by willfully disobeying a direct order from her superior officer, her actions were justified by the doctrine of military necessity and the overriding obligation to preserve American lives when faced with imminent threat." Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. "Therefore, I recommend that no further disciplinary action be taken against Major Blackwood, and that she be returned to full flight status immediately. The celebration at the base club that night was unlike anything Victoria had experienced during her deployment. Word of Colonel Walsh's recommendation had spread throughout the base within hours, and by evening, it seemed like half the aviation unit had gathered to congratulate the pilot who had stood up for American soldiers and won. Lieutenant Commander Morrison raised his beer glass with his good arm, commanding the attention of the crowded room. "To Major Victoria Blackwood," he announced, his voice carrying over the conversation and laughter, "who proved that courage isn't about following orders, it's about doing what's right when it matters most." The toast was echoed throughout the club, but Victoria felt strangely detached from the celebration. The hearing was over, her career was safe, and she would return to flying combat missions within days. But something fundamental had changed during those weeks of uncertainty and investigation. Chief Warrant Officer Rivera found her near the club's small windows, looking out at the flight line where Apache helicopters sat silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "You've been quiet tonight, ma'am," he observed. "Figured you'd be more excited about beating the charges." Victoria took a sip of her beer, considering her response. "I've been thinking about call signs," she said finally. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "Call signs?" "Trust fund. That's been mine since flight school, and it's followed me everywhere I've gone. A reminder that everyone sees my family's money before they see me." "And now?" Victoria smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "Now I think it might mean something different. Not trust fund like money, but trust fund like earning the trust of people who depend on you. Building up a fund of trust through actions instead of inheriting it through wealth." Rivera nodded slowly. "I like that interpretation better." "Me too." Victoria looked out at the helicopters again, their sleek lines and deadly armaments representing both the complexity and the simplicity of military service. "Those SEALs trusted me with their lives, and I didn't let them down. Maybe that's what being a military officer really means, building up enough trust that people will bet their lives on your judgment." The party continued around them, but Victoria found herself already thinking about the next mission, the next opportunity to prove herself worthy of the uniform she wore and the aircraft she flew. 2 days later, she was back in the cockpit, leading a formation of Apache helicopters on an escort mission for a medical evacuation flight. As they climbed into the Afghan sky, Rivera's voice came through the intercom. "Trust fund, this is your weapons officer, ready for whatever comes next." Victoria smiled inside her flight helmet. "Roger that, let's go save some lives." 6 months after the hearing, Victoria received orders transferring her to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Army's elite Night Stalkers unit. The assignment came with a promotion to lieutenant colonel and a new position as a flight instructor, responsible for training the next generation of combat pilots. Her first day at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, began with a briefing to a class of newly graduated pilots fresh from flight school. They sat in neat rows, their faces eager and nervous, their flight suits still bearing the creases of newness. Victoria recognized the look. She had worn it herself not so many years ago. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood," she began, standing before the assembled pilots. "My call sign is Trust Fund, and before any of you ask, yes, it means exactly what you think it means." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room, but most of the pilots remained focused on her words. "I want to tell you about a night in Afghanistan when I had to choose between following orders and saving lives. It's a choice that every combat pilot will face at some point in their career, and how you prepare for that moment will define not just your military service, but your character as a human being." Victoria walked among the seats as she spoke, making eye contact with individual pilots, seeing her younger self reflected in their attentive faces. Some of you come from military families. Some of you are here because flying is the only thing you've ever wanted to do. Some of you are here to serve your country, and some of you are here to prove something to yourselves or to others. All of those reasons are valid, but none of them matter when American lives are on the line. She stopped at the front of the room again, her voice taking on the weight of hard-earned experience. What matters is your ability to make the right decision under pressure, to trust your training and your instincts, and to accept the consequences of your choices. The night I'm going to tell you about, I made a decision that could have ended my career and landed me in prison. But 16 American soldiers went home to their families because of that decision, and I would make the same choice again without hesitation. For the next hour, Victoria walked them through every detail of that night above Kandahar province, the tactical situation, the radio communications, the split-second decision-making process that had led to her disobeying direct orders. She described the weight of command, the responsibility of wielding lethal force, and the moral courage required to do what was right instead of what was easy. When she finished, the room was silent for several seconds before a young pilot in the front row raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you know when you're making the right decision?" Victoria smiled, remembering asking similar questions to her own instructors years ago. You don't, not with absolute certainty, but you prepare yourself through training, through study, through understanding your mission and your values. And when the moment comes, you trust your judgment and accept the consequences. That evening, Victoria walked the perimeter of Fort Campbell as the sun set behind the Kentucky hills, her footsteps echoing on the concrete path that surrounded the base. The familiar sounds of military life surrounded her, aircraft engines being tested, soldiers calling cadence during evening physical training, the distant sound of helicopters conducting night training flights. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Commander Morrison, now recovered from his injuries and serving as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Center in California. Saw the article in Army Times about your new assignment. Congratulations, Trust Fund. Those new pilots are lucky to have you. Victoria smiled as she typed her response. Just paying it forward. Thanks for having my back during the hearing. Always will. You saved our lives. Least we could do was save your career. As she continued her walk, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The whispers about her family's wealth had largely faded, replaced by respect earned through actions under pressure. The trust fund call sign remained, but its meaning had evolved into something she wore with pride rather than shame. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Chief Warrant Officer Rivera, now serving with another Apache unit in South Korea. "Ma'am, heard through the grapevine that you..."